Okay, let's get into talking about policy management. And as kind of indicated by the subtitle there, this is going to focus on some of the operational tasks. If you are somebody who is tasked with monitoring Azure Policy and managing it day to day, what are high level objectives that you want to accomplish or things that you need to know to do your job? Some of the things we're going to talk about here. We'll talk about what it looks like to assign a policy. There's a number of settings that are kind of unique to policy assignments. It's good to understand. We'll talk about parameters. I wanted to call out parameters because they're kind of goofy when you're writing them versus applying it, and parameters are assigned during the assignment. So we'll talk about that. I also want to talk about, what does the workflow look like if you are testing or doing development in policies, and that directly ties into the next item, which is, setting a policy audit or enforce. I'm actually going to go through live some recommended policy configurations. Just one, so you can see what it looks like to create an assignment, and two, just to give your brain some context to what it looks like and why you'd want to do things live. After we assign it, we're going to go back and check our compliance reports, see what it looks like when resources aren't compliant, what we can do about that. I'm also going to talk about policy exemptions, meaning what it looks like if you have a resource that's not compliant, but that's okay and you want to allow that either for a set period of time or forever. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about some of the limitations and some of the difficulties you might encounter if you're managing Azure Policy, especially if you're just starting out and you're managing Azure Policy for an entire environment at scale. It comes with its own set of challenges, and I just want to call out what some of those are and what you might encounter. So, getting into that, let's cut over to our Edge browser here. And let's see. First thing we're going to do is talk about assignments. So let's actually pivot a little bit because we need to talk about parameters and testing and audit and enforce, but really that comes with the creating the assignment. So let's first look at some policies that are recommended. That's going to be tagging policies, which I've got a couple configured that we'll look at, and then another policy that I was going to set up as a sample was restricting resource types. So let's do that first and then walk through what the assignment parameters are and then kind of talk through what it looks like to do testing on this. So I don't know what category this would be under. Oh, cool. So it's interesting. I have this custom policy for allowed resource type. This wasn't a policy when I was looking to set it up, but it looks like they have since come out with a policy that has the exact same name and probably is written exactly the same way. So we're going to use the built-in one and we'll assign this. We have the definition here. I'm going to go ahead and click assign. We'll go over a definition structure later. First thing you have to choose when you're assigning a policy is the scope. And this is basically, are you assigning it to a root management group, a subscription, a resource group? I'm choosing for this just to focus on my lab resource group. So I'm not going to assign policies outside that scope. So we'll do that. And then you've got an assignment name. Now, this is a display name. It's not a unique identifier. There is a separate hidden name value that you can't get to if you're using the portal. So you can name this using a friendly space character name, anything that's easy for you to reference and understand. This default name is actually just fine. I don't need to change this, but we'll go ahead and do it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your testing and development of policies. If going back to the GPO example that I used in a previous video, anybody who's worked with group policies in Active Directory knows you can't just apply a group policy even if it looks really obvious and really simple as to what it's doing, unless you have already deployed that group policy in multiple places and you're really familiar with it. You just never do that. And the reason why you never do that is oftentimes a GPO works differently than you'd expect it to based on its description. You read it, sounds straightforward. Sometimes it works just like that. Other times, you run into a group policy that has strange behaviors or interactions that you're not expecting and aren't really written in the description of that group policy. Azure Policy is kind of the same way. It's not really as complicated when it comes to built-in policies that are straightforward, but every once in a while you run into a policy that doesn't check for things the way you expect it to, doesn't change things, especially if you're writing custom policies. You always want to make sure you test that policy first. So from a lifecycle management process, what I always recommend is you first create a policy in a sandbox subscription with where you can create test resources with no impact. You assign the policy as you think it should work, and then you go ahead and create those resources in your sandbox that the policy is trying to control to validate that it performs as you expect it to. 9 times out of 10, it probably will. It's pretty straightforward. Every once in a while, it won't, and then you'll need to adjust your plans accordingly. After you've done the policy testing, you understand how it works, how it's supposed to work, and what it does. At that point, you want to roll it out to your environment, right? This is where this policy enforcement tab gets really important. This also is pretty standard as far as a mechanism on really any Entra 365 Azure product now. Microsoft always tends to give you a way to either enforce or audit a policy or anything before you make the setting live. So in this case, when your policy is ready, it's been tested, and you're going to apply it to your live environment, what you want to do is create the assignment, but set this to disabled. What disabled assignments do is it checks for and reports compliance to your policy, but doesn't actually change or enforce any settings. Obviously, for an audit policy that is, or a policy that's configured to use an audit effect, that's effectively the same thing, right? It's not changing those settings, it's just monitoring for and checking them. However, if you're using a deny policy or a modify policy that does have a direct effect on resources being created, setting this to disabled will not change the settings if it's a modified policy and will not block the resource if it's a deny policy. So it's good to always, after you've tested, create your assignment for your test policies as disabled, and then check for, is this policy going to have any sort of impact on an existing workflow or on an existing resource? Obviously, policies only apply on create, so it's not going to have a direct effect even if it's enforced or enabled on existing resources, but you don't know if there's workflows out there that people are creating and destroying things dynamically until you've had it and you monitored for a little while. So for testing, always come in, do is disabled, then go look at compliance reports. Assuming everything comes back compliant, then either create a new policy that's enforced or change your assignment to being enabled, either whichever one works better for your workflow. But that's kind of the development and testing and deployment lifecycle that I've always followed and I recommend for other people. In this case, lab environment, I'm going to set this to enabled because it doesn't really matter. So from our assignment screen here, I'm going to go ahead and click next and talk about some of these options. You have the ability, and it says right here, this aids in the gradual rollout of a policy, is when you're deploying a policy and rolling it out, you can target certain resource selectors, meaning you can use these resource type, location, without location, some of these filters to narrow down the types of resources that are going to be directly targeted by the policy as it deploys. It's assumed, based on what it says in the description of a resource selector, that you come and modify this later. I've actually never had a use case to use this, so I'm not super familiar with it, but it is an option if you need to. You also have the ability to add overrides to the effect of the policy. And this is essentially doing the same thing as the policy enforcement option. You can change, if you have an audit policy, oftentimes the effects aren't just audit. You have the option of either choosing audit, deny, or disabled. So an override, if you are deploying a deny policy, you can set an override to change the effect of the policy from deny to audit or to disabled if you need to. I believe this also, no, this literally only allows you to change the one effect. I don't know why you would ever use this, but it's an option. I'm sure there's a use case that I'm just not familiar with. The last thing I was going to call out for the assignment for this is understanding parameters. If I go back to, let's see, can I pull up the definition again? This is an allowed resource type policy, right? The parameters that it needs are the list of resource types allowed. This is what you define. Oftentimes, a policy definition has a parameter defined, but there's a default value, and you won't see it in this screen unless you have this box unchecked. This checks by default, but if you're using a policy to require HTTPS, actually, that's not a good example. Let's say you require TLS minimum version 1.2. The default is to require TLS 1.2, but you can change that because it's parameterized. So if I uncheck this box, it then gives me the parameter of what do you want the default to, or what do you want to set the parameter to. In this case, for the allowed resource type policy, there is no default. This parameter is required for us to specify when we assign that policy. So I would come in here and you have to select the resources you want to allow. Let's do this for example. I'm going to allow storage account. And that's good enough for the sake of our example. So this is a policy saying the only resource type that's allowed to exist in this resource group is a storage account. Next, we're going to get into remediation in a following set of videos when we're talking about the definition structure, because there's some other considerations for remediation. And then the last thing that's good to note is on any policy that's set for audit or deny explicitly, you can set here what the message is that the user will get if they try to create a resource that's blocked. So in this case, I want to say this resource type is not allowed by policy. We'll see that in a second. And then finally, review and create. Let's go ahead and create that policy. So going to look at that assignment, I've got allowed resource type, and this says the only type that's allowed is a storage account, and that's it. So to see how this works, let's go ahead and create a storage account and see what happens. Or let's try to create something that's not a storage account. This is going to be blocked, so I don't really care that much about these settings. Next. Alright, so this is the portal view. This would be different if they're trying to deploy it by a resource, but I got to the review and create section, and it says revalidation failed. All my settings were supplied because it doesn't really need that much. If I click on this, it says this was disallowed by policy. Reasons: resource type not allowed by policy. So that's that non-compliant message that we specified in the assignment that we just created. So you can see already here that it's working. Now, knowing that it would block it, that's how a deny policy works. It's pretty straightforward. Let's instead go back and look at some policies that I created here. Now, that's an allowed resource type policy. That's going to be a really common policy that you probably configure, where you know if someone's trying to create a workload, and you know the resources that workload is going to contain, and we don't want to allow that app owner or that developer to deploy any resources outside of that. So you create an allowed resource policy, you specify in the parameters, you check the box for every resource type that is okay in his workload for him to run, and then you enforce it with a deny action. And now anytime he tries to create a resource that's not in that policy, he gets blocked. So he can't just create anything. Another really common scenario that we've mentioned before is reinforcing tags as a policy. Now, tags are kind of unique. I'm going to go down to my assignments here. Actually, let's look at compliance first. I created two policies to enforce tagging that are really common ones you'll come across. Now, I've mentioned in an example previous, the tags can be used for associating resources on a cost report, meaning you can look at the cost of resources or any resource that contains a specific tag and value. So what I did for an example, which is a very common policy, is I created two tagging policies. The first one is require a department tag on a resource group, and the second one is inherit the department tag from a resource group. Now this is my compliance screen. If I'm a policy administrator, I'm going to come here and I want to make sure that I'm seeing compliance in all of my resources. The only resources or the only assignments that I don't really care about compliance on for the most part are these ASC defaults. And if you watched some of my previous videos where I talked about the Security Center for Cloud or Defender for Cloud portal, Defender for Cloud deploys these initiatives by default. And this is how Defender for Cloud is checking for its own settings that it wants to monitor from a security perspective. This is how it populates its security score. It uses Azure Policy as an engine to evaluate those resources. So it's not uncommon to see non-compliant resources here if you don't have a 100% security score, which you might not. So I think there's ways to disable that. I haven't really looked that into it, but it's not unusual to see non-compliance there. But from another perspective, if you have policies that you are in your environment that you're controlling, you want those policies to be followed. So you want to be checking for non-compliance and you want to fix that. You should be seeing green check marks everywhere here. That's your goal as a policy administrator. Now, it says required department on resource group. If I open this assignment and it says I have 0% compliance, right? Nothing is compliant, but I'm only applying this on one resource group, and this is requiring a tag. So this is telling me I don't have a tag on this resource group. Now, if I was okay with that, like I said, your goal is to see compliant because you want it to be very obvious that there is something that is not in compliant. And if you have a whole bunch of policies assigned and half of them are not compliant, then it's not really going to be easy for you to track it because for you, compliance is kind of a who cares, right? 50%, not a big deal. But if your goal is 100% compliance in that compliance portal, then you're going to need to do whatever you have to do to manage that. Now, you can fix compliance in one of two ways. First, the correct way, you change or modify your resources so that they are in compliance with your policy. That's the right way to do it. Second, if there is a resource that cannot be configured for some way to meet that policy, you want to come in here and create what's called an exemption. This is saying, I know this resource can't meet this policy, and it allows you to specify why so that other administrators on your team or other auditors who are checking your policy can see why exactly that resource can't be configured. So if I wanted to, I could come in here and create an exemption for this required department tag thing. I'm not going to, but let's walk through what it looks like. So you name your exemption, just like an assignment, and then you have two categories of exemption. A waiver is intended to be, kind of a temporary thing, right? I know this doesn't meet policy right now, but I'm okay with it being non-compliant for a little while. And then you can set what's called an expiration date for the exemption, meaning I'm okay with this being in non-compliant state for a month. So in 1 month's time at 12 a.m., this exemption is going to expire, and I expect this resource will be fixed by then. The other category you can set is called a mitigation, meaning, and it states this right here, this policy intent is to require security, but I'm okay with this specific policy being not applying to this resource because that security concern that I've worried about is actually going to be addressed some other way. A great example of this would be if you are blocking public access to resources, you're using private endpoints and VPNs or express routes so that everything in Azure is tied to your on-prem network and you don't have any external access allowed into your Azure tenant. There might be some cases where you do need to allow external access to one or two resources for a specific reason. Now, let's say you generally don't allow things to be open to the internet, but you require a firewall rule in any of those resources that are externally facing. And the firewall rule is to allow traffic only from its designated source, right? In this case, it would be a mitigation because you grant an exception to that resource or that policy that's requiring public access be turned off, and you're saying this is mitigated because I've applied firewall rules on that resource to restrict traffic to the designated source. So in that way, the policy is mitigated. And then you can specify a description here for other people to check to say this resource has a firewall instead of blocking public access, right? something simple like that. So it's if you create an exemption, what happens then is the resource that you've created an exemption for is no longer going to be marked as non-compliant. It'll show up as compliant in your reports so that you don't have to monitor it anymore, and it allows you to go on and monitor other instances of non-compliance. Now, if I go to advanced, another thing you can do here, this is grayed out because there's only one resource that's not compliant, and it's only one resource group. But if you are using a big policy initiative on like the root of your tenant, because you have a whole series, let's say you have 100 policies that you want applied to your entire environment, right? These are global policies that our organization should always meet these rules. If that's the case, when you're creating exemptions, oftentimes you don't want to create an exemption for everything that policy touches, right? Because it's touching your entire environment. You are interested in creating an exemption only for the one resource, and specifically the one resource setting in that initiative that is failing to meet. So in that case, you come in here and you set the scope to the resource group that resource is in, and then the assignment name. In this case, if it's an initiative, you'd have a whole bunch of policy settings you do. So you choose the specific policy and resource that you want to grant that exemption to. That way, you're not granting a global exemption to all your policies for that resource. You're granting only an exception to that one policy that's actually important. You can also come down here and add resource selectors, just like the assignments, to define a dynamic exemption if needed. But that really is probably better to do from an assignment perspective than an exemption, but that's an option. And that's what an exemption does. So if I were to create this, I would no longer be marked as non-compliant, but I also wanted to show the other method, which is, this says it's requiring a department tag on resource groups, right? So if I come in here and I add a tag, department HR, and then I also have to apply the same tag here. At that point, this should be marked as compliant, and those resources will be marked as compliant. It's the same thing, right? It's checking for that tag. Now that it exists, this policy is compliant, I'm good to go. So that's the other way of remediating a non-compliant resource. You can force a compliance check using an Azure CLI command, but it takes a while to process, and Azure Policy itself updates on a somewhat irregular interval. So if I check back here in like an hour, it might be marked compliant. Otherwise, 24 hours, yeah, probably will. But there is a delay built in the portal you have to be aware of. So just setting this should meet that compliance, but I'm not going to be able to show it in the portal because there's a lag associated with it. But that is the sort of things you're monitoring for from a operational standpoint for Azure Policy. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges you get with managing Azure policies. You can kind of see already, I've only got a few here, but this portal gets very, very difficult to maintain a good view of what policies are applied and their compliance state across your entire environment, especially if you have your scope set to something really broad. So right now, I don't have that much stuff in here, right? I've got 2 subscriptions. I've got a handful of resource groups. It's not really that complicated. In a big organization, you're going to have a ton of subscriptions, a ton of resource groups, a ton of resources, and oftentimes you're only looking at evaluating the compliance for certain ones. Now, the problem is, if I check a box, this is also made difficult because my subscriptions are in my root management group. But let's say I'm only concerned about my landing zone online management group and the resources that are in that group. If I check this box for the scope and hit select, I'm actually not going to see anything because the assignments are created at the root level and they don't filter down. This is only going to show me assignments that are filtered here, which makes it really difficult to select things. Now, it gets difficult to evaluate from a scope perspective from that thing. It also gets difficult just because the list is really long. Now, you'll notice I hit clear all selections, this select button goes away, and now I hit cancel, and it's still selected the same scope. This is another thing that just drives me nuts about this portal and trying to manage policies here, because I can clear all selections, but then it doesn't reset this. So I have no way of resetting compliance if I've adjusted that scope. There's nuances like this that just drive me nuts about trying to evaluate this sort of thing in the portal. There's also problems where if you are applying policies, let's say you have a policy applied at your root management group, then you create an exemption to that policy to a specific subscription where you're going to have online resources that won't meet it, and then you have a separate sub policy underneath that to do settings for those. How do you know which policy is applying from an end user perspective, or what policy you're required to? Because your organization is going to have their master policies defined, and your policy administrators might have created that exemption and created their separate sub policies, but how is that communicated to your users? Doing that sort of communication documentation gets to be really important, but also gets to be really difficult from the user's perspective on what's exactly happening. You also have this issue where if you're using modify policies to change resource values, there's no record that that policy applied unless you're looking at specific activity logs. So you might have a setting that's being changed, but the developer doesn't realize that setting is being changed by policy. It's just changing, and it's having unattended consequences. So visibility and documentation become extra important. You also might run into policies where the policy is configured to deny or block a certain thing, but because of a very specific set of reasons, that deny won't be taking effect. I don't have the document pulled up, but there's a GitHub repo from Microsoft for Azure Policy. Actually, let me see if I can find it really fast. Yeah, it doesn't look like it's in this repo. But there are... Actually, this is it right here. Okay. So there are a whole bunch of specific resource types that have special situations to them. Resources that are exempt from policy evaluation. If you don't know, there are some. There are some that you might exceed current enforcements and compliance scale. So if you have a big enough sort of resources, the policy just won't apply. There are some resources that won't display non-compliant messages. There are also some, I don't want to find the exact documentation, but I know of certain instances I've come across personally where it's a deny policy, something should be blocked, but because that specific resource type can't be evaluated correctly by Azure Policy, it just skips the enforcement and the thing's allowed. So there are certain instances where policies will not apply correctly, so it's very important that you are doing the day 2 operational activity of monitoring compliance so you can find ways to follow up on those things and enforce them. Otherwise, things just might be getting by you. So there is an aspect of Azure Policy where it's not perfect. There are scenarios that it can't check for or can't check for correctly, and oftentimes you can find documentation explaining why, but understanding why doesn't actually help you with the enforcement of it. So monitoring it becomes really important. Now, there are some other nuances of policies that I'm going to get into in the last section where I'm actually breaking down policy definitions and we're going through the process of creating them. But for the sake of this, just know there are challenges to it. And the solution to a lot of these challenges, especially when it comes to managing policies in an enterprise environment or managing them at scale and giving yourself a lot more flexibility and better ownership and visibility over everything, oftentimes it does come down to you have to come up with a solution for managing Azure Policy using code. Using the portal does not scale well. It's not a very long-term solution. It's great for a small environment and getting started, but you'll very quickly run into issues that get to be much easier once you've converted your policy to a code base and you're using something like Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions to deploy and manage your policies, and everything is managed by some sort of state engine. I'll specifically call out enterprise policy as code as kind of the really common solution for that. This is a Microsoft supported solution, and it's a set of PowerShell scripts for managing and deploying policy that basically converts everything into JSON objects, your assignments, exemptions, compliance reports, definition sets, everything, so you can manage them from a repo. It does make your life a lot easier, but I'm not going to get into this. This is more of like an advanced policy tutorial sort of thing, so I might talk about that in a later series of videos. All right. let's hold on. Let's skip. That's all right. There you go. Okay. So we talked about some of the policy management things. We went through what it looks like to create an assignment and the different settings that are available. We also talked about kind of the lifecycle workflow of, making sure you're testing a policy for its intended consequences, setting to audit versus enforce mode. We went over a couple of policies that for like tagging that is used to enforce tagging standards because that's really common. We also created one for controlling resource types. After creating one, we take a look at the compliance portal so you can kind of evaluate what resources are compliant versus which aren't. And then kind of took a look at what it looks like, talked about how you want to make sure you strive for compliance as much as possible in your portal. And one of the methods for doing that is to use policy exemptions for resources that you cannot meet your policy compliance requirements for whatever reason. And then we did a little bit of a rant about the fact that you will run into issues managing Azure Policy. It is a giant product with its own set of challenges, and once you start to scale, it has its own set of issues, and it's not perfect. So you do need to try. It's really extra important for you to continuously be monitoring your compliance portal, especially if compliance is critical. And if you're not doing that actively, you can run into situations where policies are not being met and followed unexpectedly. Our next video, a final one in the Azure Policy series, is going to be on policy definitions, and this is going to be taking a little bit of a deeper look into the definition structure and how policies are written. This is kind of the bridge step where if we were going to get into a more advanced video, that would be the first step, because we're going to get into creating some custom policies and applying them and some of the nuances there. So next video is going to have a lot of content. Looking forward to it. Thanks.